And a very good evening to everybody. Welcome to this live stream on the 3rd of March. This is our live stream number 97. Christopher Daigan coming to you from my home in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. I'm really hoping you can join us for the next hour for another of our piano hour sessions on Wednesday. This is the Wednesday informal piano session. And today we are going to have the second part or the second session of Tales of Intrigue. These are anecdotes, stories. I'm going to be dealing with some interesting background stories to episodes involving Vivaldi, Haydn, Tchaikovsky, and Ravel. This is not academic information. Some of this might be rather contentious and rather not sort of various opinions around some of these things. But nevertheless, it's very interesting. And of course, I will be playing music by all of those composers as well. So there's going to be a lot more talking and chat in this evening than there will be music, but certainly I hope you are going to enjoy the music and what I have to offer. If you are able to support us once again, please do visit our website, musicrevival.co.za, and you'll find all the information there about our future streams. We'll be publishing new information tomorrow about our live streams number 99, which is next Wednesday, and as well as our live streams 100, 101 and 102, which will be taking place next week, Friday, Saturday and Sunday, with the visiting guitarist James Grace. And for those of you who live in this part of the world, in KZN Midlands, also can tell you that James will be giving one public concert. Now that we have moved to lockdown level 1, we are allowed to have a concert in a large venue at 50% capacity, and that will take place at the Tatham Art Gallery on Sunday the 14th of March. I think it's the 14th of March at 11 a.m. But that information will be published on my website tomorrow. So say where you'll find also all the links of various ways that you can support us with these live streams and the ongoing costs. So on with our Tales of Intrigue part 2. I'm going to start off with Vivaldi. In the first session I talked about a few weeks ago, I mentioned the idea that much of Bach's music hadn't been published during his life, and in fact only 3% of Bach's compositions were reached publication. Principal reason for this apparently is, apart from the fact that it was very tricky to print large scores, orchestral scores and choral scores, the only real music that was printed was keyboard music, which was much more easier to print, and also were able to sell more copies of the music. But the interesting thing about it is that Bach himself was in a situation where he was a very, incredible composer, composed an incredible amount, a wonderful amount of music, but also his life was very much centered around the small German provincial towns where he worked, and where the most of his music was composed for the church congregations where he was employed. Whereas composers like Handel was a very cosmopolitan composer. He wrote opera, which was performed publicly. His orchestral works were performed publicly, and many more of them were published. He also revolved and worked in major courts, including Munich, Italy, and in England. So he had a much greater reach and much more substantial backing behind him. Vivaldi, interestingly enough, Italian composer, spent much of his life teaching at a very unique and a very special school in Venice. As a young man, Vivaldi took orders as a priest and didn't work as a priest for a particularly long time. Apparently he suffered from asthma or breathing difficulties, so his career as a practicing priest was very short-lived. But for many years he was attached to a school, an orphanage really, of foundlings, which was in Venice. Now, Venice was apparently a very cosmopolitan, almost like a party city, and many people visited. And occasionally there would be an incident where perhaps a young princess or one member of the aristocracy, young woman, found herself with a difficult pregnancy. And to avoid any prosecution or any difficulty, you might say, this school, or this kind of orphanage which was attached to the church, would accept children. There was a little door, apparently, which would only take the size of a young child, a very young child, and No questions were asked. The child was simply passed through this door. Also, people who were particularly poor, who had children who were not able to support them, were able to pass on their children, knowing full well that these children would be looked after. And amazingly, the young boys were taught skills and eventually taught trades and sent out into the world at the age of about 13 or 15. But the young women were taught various skills, various activities, and most importantly, trained in music. And this orchestra and the musicians that were part of this church, that the organization attached to the church that Vivaldi taught, as I say, for many years, and he was allowed to because of his priest qualifications. He, in fact, composed many, many works for them. Many of his compositions, his concertos, he wrote over 500 concertos, and many of them were written for these highly skilled, brilliant young ladies who played in orchestras and played solo instruments. So he would compose a solo concerto for flute, and then for 2 flutes, and then for violin, and then for cello, for mandolin, 500 concertos. Some critics have said he composed the same concerto 500 times, which is a rather unfortunate way of putting it, but nevertheless, everyone has their critics. And these musicians were famed all over Europe. People traveled from far and wide to see these young women play, or at least to hear them. Because the fascinating part about this for me is that part of the social makeup of the time, it seems it was inappropriate for young women to be seen performing on stage. So in fact, these orchestras and choirs who were famed behind screens which were positioned in front of the orchestra on the balconies, so that in fact no one could actually see them directly. They might see a corner of an elbow, they might see a knee, a part of a shadow of a face, but they would never actually see an entire performer or the orchestra as a whole. Vivaldi himself was known as the Red Priest because of his flaming red hair. We're going to show you an image of Vivaldi, a lovely portrait of the composer. Apparently his hair is not red in this particular picture because he is wearing a wig, which would have been normal for that time. And I need to move this way so you can still see me. What the other little interesting anecdote and I find so intriguing about this is Vivaldi's music. Some of it was published. His collection of concertos, which included a series of 4 pieces called the 4 Seasons, was published in Holland. And much of his music just fell into obscurity. It was forgotten about. And in about 1930, in a church in Turin, someone discovered in a cupboard, in a vault somewhere, an incredible amount, an amazing thousands of manuscripts, including the original 4 Seasons manuscript of that the composer's handwriting had been lying there for over 200 years that no one had touched them. And now the Vivaldi Museum is established in that town and all the manuscripts are there. Pieces of music were still being discovered only a few years ago, pieces of music of the composer that had never been heard of before. The little detail about this, which I find so fascinating, is that the link between a musical organization or organization that cares for children and that nurtures youngsters and also teaches them music has become linked ever since. If you ever wondered why is a conservatory, the Moscow Conservatory, the Paris Conservatoire, why is a music school called a conservatory, this is exactly where it comes from. The fact that these music schools were actually there to conserve, care for, look after these young children. I find it a really fascinating story and fascinating to be able to think that these performers would have been so famed and so well known, so brilliant in their skill, and yet they were never seen. They were always hidden behind these screens. So I'm going to play for you a little piece of Vivaldi himself. He didn't write any keyboard music, but the composer, Johann Sebastian Bach, wrote a number of keyboard works where he copied Vivaldi's concertos. Sometimes he thought he made little improvements. He rewrote parts that he didn't like and published them as transcriptions of Vivaldi's pieces. So from a concerto in G major, I'm going to play for you the first movement. You will hear in this, and I've tried to emulate this in the performance, sections which are broader or sections which are grander, contrasted with sections which are very quiet. So the grander section being the whole orchestra playing together, the quieter sections being with just the one solo instrument playing on its own. First movement of a concerto by Vivaldi as arranged for keyboard by Johann Sebastian Bach. Vivaldi's recognition or reinvention, revival you might say, as much as Bach's was took place spearheaded by Mendelssohn in Leipzig in about 1820 or 1825. Vivaldi waited a good couple of years, and only in about 1920, 1930 was a Vivaldi festival held in Italy for the first time, and people rediscovered his music, including an amazing work which they had never heard for many, many years, called The Four Seasons. And of course, we all know The Four Seasons. One of the most well-known tunes nowadays. And it's also, until recently, the most recorded classical piece of music ever. Amazing to think that, in fact, only a few, 100 years ago or so, people had never heard of it. You said to someone, oh, I'm a great fan of Vivaldi. They would have not known who you are talking about. I'm going to move on to the music of Franz Joseph Haydn, and a really, really intriguing story here. Haydn was a very celebrated and grand composer and a musician who really traveled extensively. He was very well in Vienna. He traveled throughout Germany and spent a lot of time in England, was very popular and had a great career in London. In terms of, and I have to qualify this, in terms of his age, he was born in 1732 and died in 1809, which means he was 77 years old. And I've said this before, that I once talked about another composer, Beethoven. I said, well, Beethoven was relatively old when he died. Haydn was particularly old when he died. And of course, everyone in the audience looked at me astonished, because 77 is not that old. You have to realize, of course, in Vienna at this time, the average life expectancy was 37 years old. So for Haydn to be 77 years old is a very good innings, you might say. Now, when Haydn died, he had been in the employment of the Prince Esterhazy at the Esterhazy court, which is now part of Hungary, near Vienna. And when his death occurred rather suddenly, they were at war. Vienna was at war, and so a hasty burial was arranged, and a befitting burial befitting the composer was not really possible at that particular time. About 20 years later, the Prince Esterházy decided that his good friend and someone he admired very much had to be moved from Vienna, his body exhumed, and returned to Eisenstadt, where he was born. Of course, much to his surprise, they went to exhume Haydn's coffin from his grave and found a wig with his skull. His head was missing. There was a body and a wig, but no head. A rather horrific occurrence to discover. What apparently had transpired was that a few days after Haydn's death, two gentlemen by the name of Rosenkranz and Peters had hired a grave robber to exhume Haydn's body for the first time, sever his head and remove it, because they were interested in a very new study of science at the time called phenology, which referred or was a study of the parts of the skull, cranium, to see that people of genius, or someone like Haydn, might have a certain bumps or certain marks within their skull, or certain spaces in their skull, which allowed them to achieve mental ability. Of course, this was found to be not true. But nevertheless, the skull was removed, and Mr. Rosenkranz proudly, for many, many years, kept it at home, had it cleaned off, kept it at home, and was very happy to offer it to anybody who wanted to see it. The Prince Esterházy, this is 20 years after Haydn's death, discovered this, got wind of this fact that had been traveling around Vienna, and the authorities paid an inspection to Mr. Rosenkranz's house to look for the skull. They searched high and low, and they could not find it, and eventually transpired that his wife, who was really not feeling well and refused to leave her bed, was actually hiding it in the straw in her mattress. Anyway, the authorities left with a skull that they thought was Haydn's, but in fact was that of another random person. And this, eventually Mr. Rosenkranz carried on displaying the skull as Haydn's. It made its way through various museum collections until as late as 1935, I think it is. Let me just check on this date to be sure. 1954, in fact, was the final date that eventually Haydn was buried, because this skull had been in a museum, German museum, and been on display. Eventually, he was reunited with the rest of his corpse and the original skull. So Haydn features two skulls. He's buried with two skulls, that of the real skull and that of the person that was handed over to the authorities as Haydn's skull. And this is in the church in the village Eisenstadt, where he was born. And that only took place in 1954. I would like to play for you something of Haydn's music. Haydn is often regarded as a very jovial composer. There's elements of great lightness and real joking and real joy in his music, particularly in the second of the movements which I'm going to play for you. You'll hear that element. But in the first piece, which is the slow movement, I'm going to play the second and third movements from the sonata in F. You'll hear a beautiful lyricism, a real poignancy, and there's always often great depth in Haydn's music. But that jokingness and that lightness is something we often associate with Haydn's music. And in one of the articles, I was reading about this rather unfortunate incident. They talked about Haydn's joy in his music and laughing his head off, literally. joking, joyful, and very playful antics of Joseph Haydn, Franz Joseph Haydn there, who had, as I said, a rather unfortunate burial, you might say. It took him a very, very long time to finally find his final and complete resting place. Moving on to a story, a rather contentious issue about the composer Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Very interesting, very unique idea here. Tchaikovsky's music, very popular. It's so amazing how he wrote these wonderful melodies, such incredibly passionate music. Sleeping Beauty, Swan Lake, so many incredible and so many exciting, wonderful pieces of music. Ballet, piano concertos, violin concertos, songs, opera. I mean, it's an incredible outpouring of very, very passionate music. And what's intriguing about this is the idea of this mystery that still surrounds Tchaikovsky's death. There's official versions, there are rumors, there are many possibilities, and of course it's very difficult when things are not written down in any concrete way, or when people are talking of hearsay or accounts that are related from one person to another, or people are writing biographies and not able to write what they're really wanting to write, or writing accounts of situations which are edited and not allowed to actually say what really took place. Tchaikovsky himself, I find the idea of any composer, in fact, writing a brilliant piece of music, a very exciting concerto, for instance, like the piano concerto or the violin concerto, how a composer writes such complicated music without having a real virtuoso or a real integrated understanding of the instrument. Tchaikovsky was neither a brilliant pianist nor a brilliant violinist. In the case of the piano concerto, very interesting, and this is the work, of course. Tchaikovsky first played this at the very first outing. He presented it to Anton Rubenstein, the great Russian pianist, and after he played it through, Rubenstein said that there was not one thing in the entire work that was worth saving, that it was all nonsense, which was, of course, a huge disappointment, and Tchaikovsky was wanting to dedicate this work to Rubenstein. The intriguing part about that particular piece of music is that it was rewritten by a number of people, including Hans von Bülow and a number of other pianists who assisted Tchaikovsky or advised him to rewrite things that would be more suitable in terms of the way that the piano would carry the melodic lines and also the way that it would interact with the orchestra. Because to play a piano concerto, to play a piano against a full orchestra of 70 musicians who playing full out, it requires a great deal of skill for writing, to be able to write to make the piano sound brilliant, to carry it over the orchestra. And even, for instance, the grand opening chords were not Tchaikovsky's doing at all. What Tchaikovsky wrote was more very harp-like and very simple, much not having that grandeur of those thundering basses and that brilliant treble expanding into a really powerful, thunderous kind of accompaniment that carries through the orchestral melody. That was not Tchaikovsky's idea. He was advised to change it. In the case of the violin concerto, very interestingly, Tchaikovsky had a great deal of inspiration. This is one of his most passionate pieces, and he was very much inspired by the young man, Joseph Kotek, who he was spending a lot of time with. They were in a very passionate engagement relationship at the time, and he was very much in love. And this expression of music, this feeling of incredible intensity, wonderful intensity, is expressed in the music. And they were spending a lot of time, they were on an extended vacation in Switzerland, I think it was. And here they were spending all the time together. And of course, anything that Tchaikovsky had to express his musical idea, he could have this brilliant violinist who was an exceptional virtuoso explain to him and show him exactly how to bring about these ideas, how to best to write the music, and how the violin could easily produce brilliance here, or this would be more difficult, or this idea could be realized and exemplified in a better way if he changed the notes accordingly. And so this piece of music was really a great inspiration. As I say, Tchaikovsky was very, very much in love and very inspired to write this piece. When he wanted to dedicate it, however, he didn't dedicate it to the violinist for fear that the relationship was well known, it was public, and that in fact it might cause a scandal. So he withdrew that actual violinistic dedication on the work and gave it to someone else, which apparently caused a great deal of upset and was part of the breakdown in their relationship in the end. With the piano concerto, Anton Rubenstein, who, as I say, when he first heard it, said it was not worth saving, ended up becoming one of its biggest champions. The work was in fact premiered not in Moscow, but in Boston in the year of 1885. And this was a grand moment. The piece was a great success. Tchaikovsky had also been invited on several tours, and his worldwide recognition was expanding. He had been invited to conduct at the opening concert of Carnegie Hall. The reason that his death is a bit of a mystery is that the official story is that Tchaikovsky, who was then 52 years old, in the middle of a cholera outbreak in Moscow, drinks contaminated water and dies. And there are many people who thought, well, this is a bit strange, this is a bit odd. He apparently drank this in a restaurant, and one of the things which was, it had been always frowned upon, or always been quite curious, is that Tchaikovsky's body was not treated as if he had been died of this died of actual. Lucy, you're distracting me. Lucy's here squeaking. Cholera, infectious disease are the words I'm looking for. And he apparently, I think he even lay in state for a few days, and his body was visited by a number of people. Now, if a person had died of this disease, they would not have had any contact with anybody. In addition, Tchaikovsky would have been very affluent. He went to a restaurant apparently and was served a glass of contaminated water. The restaurant itself was a very affluent place, a very well-to-do, very prestigious place, and it would be very unlikely that they would have served something like that to him. And cholera was a disease that was associated with very much poorer people, and Tchaikovsky was a very affluent and well-to-do person. So there's so many elements about this as to why he would have suddenly made such an error, or in the middle of this outbreak, suddenly been exposed to this and died, and he was only 52 years old. In more recent years, there have been many rumors. People, even as recently as in the 1920s, people coming forward to say that they were at meetings and they were witness to situations where, in fact, Tchaikovsky was asked to take his own life. He was at that point involved in a relationship with a very prominent duke, the son of a very prominent duke at the time, and apparently this was now becoming a great embarrassment to, they thought, the people. And it was, apart from Tchaikovsky's great public persona and his presence internationally, this issue was now something that authorities did not want to have continuing. And Tchaikovsky was actually given poison, possibly arsenic, and asked to please take his own life. And while some people, Russian authorities, will say, well, no, that's not true, there's no proof. As I say, there's so many issues, there's so many inconsistencies around it, and so many rumors and stories around this, it's very difficult, and probably we will never know what the final outcome of this is. As I say, the extraordinary thing is that so much of Tchaikovsky's music, you think of Sleeping Beauty, Swan Lake, The Nutcracker, how much of this music is so incredibly popular, and he was only 52 years old when he died. So I would like to play for you from a series of pieces by Tchaikovsky from the Seasons. But before that, I'd like to show you a portrait of Tchaikovsky, a very wonderful portrait by a very well-known Russian artist. Barry is going to bring that up on the screen. This is Tchaikovsky. This was actually painted a year after his death, I believe, because Tchaikovsky no, this was painted sometime earlier, I think. And then the second image, which is a very interesting, I think, early photograph of some type. This is Tchaikovsky with the young artist Joseph Kotek, the young violinist, as I said, who was in a relationship with Tchaikovsky and was the inspiration for the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. A very passionate and wonderfully exciting work that really explores, as I said, it's fascinating how a composer can write so well for an instrument that they've never played, but certainly his inspiration from the violinist and the violinist's help in a very intimate living situation would have certainly helped them. I'm going to play from his series of the pieces, The Seasons. Tchaikovsky wrote quantity of piano music, but none of it is as often played as many other composers like Chopin or Liszt. And a beautiful, a very mournful, melancholic piece actually from his Seasons from the month of October, a piece called Autumn Song. That was the autumn song, October, from the month of October, from a set of pieces Tchaikovsky wrote called The Seasons. Apparently he was invited to submit a composition on a monthly basis for a journal which was being published every month. And after becoming a bit unstuck and really struggling, not struggling, but finding himself very much at the deadline each month, he decided, well, let me just finish the set of pieces, and whisked off a couple of compositions to make up the last month. So he had everything in advance. That was a very beautiful piece, as I say, called October or Autumn Song. In the last section of this evening's program, I'm going to be talking about the music of Ravel, and also prefaced by a slight incident with the composer George Gershwin. Now, Maurice Ravel, great French composer, was still is really acknowledged as the master of orchestration. In other words, the skill of writing for an orchestra, not just being able to get everything in the right place or to write for the instruments in a correct and appropriate way, but really to understand how the instruments and the timbre, the tone colors of the various instruments can work with the strings, combining with the woodwinds and certain components of the woodwinds, combining with elements of brass, etc., and creating beautiful and really magnificent sounds. Ravel was really quite an expert and had something quite unique and a special gift for this. So the composer George Gershwin, great composer of musicals, he made his name as a Broadway musical composer, and from these musicals, all the songs like Wonderful, I Got Plenty of Nothing, Embraceable You, all of these popular songs came from these musicals, and he was very successful. But he also viewed himself and wrote music as a classical composer that was blending or really combining elements of the jazz style within classical frameworks. A piano concerto in American Paris, Rhapsody in Blue, for instance, an orchestral piece with a jazz piano combined into one film. And so he decided, well, he wanted to go and study. He wanted to study with Ravel. And apparently they had a meeting, and there's a picture of this during Ravel's tour, I think of no, I'm not actually sure what the date is. There's a picture of Ravel with Gershwin that Barry will be able to show you. And there are a number of people. In this picture, you'll see Ravel at the piano and Gershwin standing next to him on the far right. Apparently, Gershwin said to Ravel that he would like to study with him and he would like him to teach his great skill of writing for the orchestra. And Ravel responded, he said, well, I'm not quite sure how this would work. And Gershwin said, well, how much would you charge? I would have to pay you for this. And Ravel was a bit sort of flummoxed, I suppose. He said, well, we never really thought about that. And he said, well, tell me, Mr. Gershwin, how much do you earn? And then I will actually be able to establish, what an appropriate charge would be for you to study with me. And Gershwin revealed a figure, which was obviously a quite substantial amount. I mean, he was a very successful composer. Ravel responded, he said, well, in that case, perhaps it is I who should be studying with you. You should be teaching me a thing or two, seeing as you are so successful. This was apparently the anecdote or the idea, that conversation that took place between them. But the interesting thing about it, actually, is that I was reading an article about this other day, that people have traced, there's often historical insight into and research done into actually where these anecdotes came from. Where did they start? Who witnessed this meeting? Who witnessed the conversation? Is there any evidence, letters, or any sort of thing that refers to this? And apparently the only real source of this conversation was, in fact, Gershwin himself. It's quite possible that Gershwin invented this story, which was obviously given great credibility, much in the same way as when I was talking about Liszt, that Liszt was supposedly receiving this consecration kiss. When Liszt was 12 years old, he played a public concert that was attended by the great Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven was so impressed that he stood up from the front row and kissed Liszt on the head. although in fact there seem to be very few other accounts that this incident actually took place. And the fact that Liszt kept changing the story and changing the details around this might also lead to the fact that this might not really have happened. But that's not really what we're going to talk about. What I would like to tell you about is a fascinating idea of Ravel's most celebrated composition, which it has an ongoing history, apparently. So in about 1927, he was asked by the choreographer Ida Rubenstein to write music for a ballet for her to choreograph for her company on a Spanish theme and a Spanish style. And Ravel had a great love for Spanish music. He wrote a number of works that were greatly inspired by the Spanish rhythms and Spanish ideas. And he wanted to set about writing and orchestrating a number of the piano pieces of Isaac Albéniz, pieces like Granada, is what, maybe not the exact one, but that's what Albéniz wrote. And through this music, Ravel would have orchestrated and turned Albéniz's piano music into music for orchestra, for the orchestra to play for this dance piece, this ballet. But Albéniz's music, the actual copyright for it and the orchestration rights had been awarded to somebody else, so Ravel was not allowed or not able to do that. He set about eventually writing a piece of music, which he viewed as a technical exercise. He said it was an exercise purely in this art of orchestration, this art of combining and exploiting and exploring the tone color of different instruments and combining them in unusual ways. He wrote a piece of music that is 15 to 18 minutes, I think it's about 18 minutes long. It has one melody which is repeated 18 times, and it starts very, very quietly, and it builds constantly into a massive fortissimo climax. He called it a crescendo exercise in orchestration. This, of course, is his famous composition, the Ravel's, what am I saying? I can't play it. Bolero. This piece of music that is so celebrated and so famous in Ravel's repertoire. At the first performance, when it was first performance, a woman stood up at the end of the piece of music, this incessant music that just went on and on with the same rhythm and the same melody being repeated. She said, "This is the music of a madman. This is music of madness." And the next day, Ravel replied, she said, yes, she understood, she got it right. It's exactly what it was. He kind of dismissed it as an exercise. He thought it was just something that he could produce. It exploited his ideas, it brought his talents to the fore, and really was something that he didn't take even seriously as a piece of music. But yet it has, as I say, become his most celebrated composition. So when Ravel died in 1937, he had never married, he had no children, he left his entire estate to his brother. And part of the concept, certainly in terms of now in 20th century music, is that musicians own the rights, the royalties and the rights are to be collected from any performance or any recordings of a piece of music. So Ravel left the royalty rights to his family, brother, and this included this famous composition, which means that every time for a period of a number of years that anyone officially played an orchestral piece or recorded any of Ravel's music, they would have to pay a quantity of money in order to legally do this. Now, royalties, the legalities around this actually still exist, obviously, and they change, interestingly enough, from country to country. In certain countries, including New Zealand, South Africa, China, the date is the year of the death of the composer plus 70 years, which means that in the year Ravel died in 1937, which means that in 2017, I think it is, 1997 actually, or to 2007, I think. I'm getting muddled here. The royalties fell away. The royalty fell away on Ravel's rights for this particular, for all of his music. In Europe, it's the year of death plus 80 years, and in America, it's actually 100 years or extended. So, in fact, still to play Ravel's Bolero or any of his other works in a public, official public sense, it involves a fee to be paid. So, someone, of course, was collecting this money. Ravel's brother eventually passed on and left it to his masseurs. They then passed this on to various other people, their family members, and someone was collecting, someone completely unrelated to Ravel was collecting this money that they had inherited as part of the royalties for this music for many, many years. And it is said, someone wrote in terms of a study, I'm not sure if it's actually true or just a bit of an anecdote, that somewhere in the world, every 10 minutes, a performance of this piece of music is starting somewhere. And even since 1960, approximately 60 million euros just in that period alone, up to 2000, was to be collected from the performance of Ravel's work. A substantial amount of money. Even recently, you know, I mean, considering Ravel died in 1937, about 10 years ago, another family challenged this in court and said that they actually had right to part of this estate because Ravel's music had been partly co-inspired or co-invented by the person who actually produced the idea or who produced the actual choreography for this. This was taken to court and they were turned down. They were also after family, certainly was after this large, substantial amount of money because they had actually died much later than 1937. So I would like to play for you two short pieces of music. First of which a piece by George Gershwin, which is just going to give you an idea of Gershwin's style, combining this element of jazz with popular music. This is the first of his three preludes. And then to end this evening's program, a rather substantial piece by Maurice Ravel, not the Bolero itself, because it really doesn't work on the piano. You need all those orchestral sounds and all those instruments to make it happen. But I will play another Spanish piece by him, the Albarado del Graciosa, which is full of Spanish flair, and certainly this is a piece of music which Ravel wrote in an orchestral version and in a piano version, which work equally well. It was the Albarado Del Graciosa, a piece of music from the set Miroir by Maurice Ravel in a Spanish style, to end this evening's performance, bringing together that Bolero, the Spanish Bolero, the piece of music that Ravel wrote and that composed for a Spanish-inspired ballet as requested by the choreographer Ida Rubenstein. As I say, a piece of music that repeats the same melody 18 times with a persistent, consistent rhythm that doesn't stop, from pianissimo, crescendo to the maximum fortissimo. A very unique piece of music that even Ravel, or that not even Ravel in particular, did not regard as music, but rather as an exercise, but certainly went on to make him and those who inherited his estate an enormous amount of money. That brings an end to this evening's piano hour. I hope you've enjoyed the session this evening with some unusual stories. I'll be having a classical program of music on Saturday, with music by Liszt, Chopin, Mozart, and Debussy. And as I say, very exciting programs next week on Wednesday, as well as extra streams for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And that's going to be in our celebration of our 100th, can you believe, 100 live stream sessions. And it's been a great journey. For those of you who are on our mailing lists, you will be receiving the email tomorrow with a behind-the-scenes look. Barry's giving you behind-the-scenes video guide of what the studio looks like, how it all works, how it all fits together, and some interesting little details about how it's worked and what it's been for him. Thank you to him again. Barry, thank you for your support and for your technical support this evening and for running the controls. And I'm not quite sure why the image is gone. Why have I got no image? It's gone black. I've disappeared. There we go. Even I could see that. Thanks, Barry. Thank you very much for joining us. Please support us if you can. We value every support that comes through. Thanks to the girls. Look, here's only got little Wendy Pop, who's Wendy Pop. Oh, Wendy Pop's fast asleep. Wendy Pop's not even taking any notice of me this evening. No, we'll have to wait until Saturday. Wendy Pop's in her cushion with Tomato, and maybe Wendy and Lucy will make an appearance on Saturday. So thank you for joining us this evening. I've disappeared to black again. One of the cameras has disappeared. The battery's gone. So thank you for coming along, and we look forward to seeing you Saturday and next week. Look after yourself and stay well.